Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cassandra Jesse. I'm the Director for Youth Power Learning, and I welcome you to one of our webinars on on children and adolescents, speaking truth to adults, ethics, and participation. I'm excited about this particular presentation. It's done in partnership with several evaluators from the American Evaluation Association that are part of the Youth-Focused Evaluation Topical Interest Group. And it builds on some of the work that they have done and have shared through the American Evaluation Association conference, and something that really aligns well with what we at Youth Power Learning are doing and how we learn from and raise the voices of young people, but do so in ways that are empowering to them and that are in line with ethical principles that are really important for protecting and supporting them. So wanted to just take a moment to share a little bit about who we are as Youth Power Learning for those that you might be new to us. We are a USAID funded project and are managed by Making Sense International. We are advancing solutions through evaluation and research and supporting programming that improves the capacity of young people and empowers them to lead and participate fully in society. And a big part of our focus is around positive youth development. Positive youth development really recognizes the strengths and the assets that young people bring, their ability to leverage those assets in what we think about as agency, their ability to contribute positive change to themselves and the communities around them, and then enabling the support, the enabling environment that actually helps raise them up. So I'm excited to be able to introduce to you our presenters today. First, we have Jessica Orzon. She's a research associate at the Policy Evaluation and Research Unit in Manchester Metropolitan University. So she's coming from us in our afternoon. She has 10 years experience of evaluation projects in the field of social intervention and policies targeting children and their families. And she's involved in research that's measuring youth well-being across Europe, and the evaluations of programs that target young people leaving the care system for the Department of Education and NESTA in the United Kingdom. Jessica is a member of the UK Evaluation Society as well. Nick Petton is our next consultant. He's hailing from us from Canada. He's a researcher, consultant, and evaluator focused on how to meaningfully and ethically involve children and youth in research, evaluation, and program design. He's a representative of professional associations in several functions, the Canadian Evaluation Society and the American Evaluation Society, and he's in fact the communications chair for AEA, the youth-focused topical interest group within that association, and he's an independent evaluation consultant. Monica Ruiz-Caceres is an associate professor of psychiatry and faculty at the Center for Research on Children and Families in the School of Social Work at McGill University. She is a primary investigator at the Sherpa Research Center in Montreal. She has her PhD in policy analysis and management and human services studies. One of the things about Monica is that, and Monica, just so you know, your name had come up in the work that you had done recently in Senegal, and how she has really focused a lot on transcultural child psychiatry at McGill University, and serves as an advisor to the International Ethical Research Involving Children project, and has a lot of emphasis in ethical studies involving young people. She is a program chair for the Youth-Focused Evaluation TIG at AEA as well. So I'm excited to welcome you all, and would like to pass the mic over to Jessica to get us started this morning.
Oh, great, I'm unmuted. Hi everyone, and thank you Cassandra for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for attending the webinar. So I am going to talk a bit about child consent in the context of Europe. Getting and securing child consent is the first step towards meaningful participation, so it's an important one. And before we go into more detail, just a quick reminder that child participation is not just good practice, it is a right. And it's been written into the Convention of the Rights of the Child, as well as the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Both stipulate that children have a right to express their views and that they should be listened to, especially in matters that concern them. In the case of Europe, actually, we do have a few regulations that may come and make this process a bit more complicated. We have a new European regulation, which is called the General Data Protection Regulation, which came in last year in May, and came a bit as a bombshell. So practices which were okay before, although not necessarily good practice, are now not possible anymore. So, for instance, what I have seen before is evaluators or researchers going into schools and asking parents to opt out of a research project rather than opting in. So you'd have a consent form, and at the bottom of it you'd have a line saying, if you do not wish for your child to participate in this study, please return this consent form. This is no longer okay under this new regulation. People have to opt in and be clearly informed about what they are opting in. It does make our work as evaluators a bit more complicated, especially when it comes to data sharing agreements, but also it does mean that we have more complex consent forms because they are becoming longer, as we do need to provide more details around who's the data processor, who's the data controller, and how long we're keeping the data. A lot of very technical details which makes informed consent a bit more complicated than it used to be. Beyond the global kind of more international regulation, we also do need to comply with our national regulations. So each of you coming from so many different countries, there will be different rules when it comes to engaging children and whether you need to get parental consent or not. So across Europe, this changes quite a bit, with some countries saying you do need to get parental consent up to the age of 18. This is the case, for instance, in Malta. And some countries saying it's only necessary for children up to the age of 13, such as in Poland. And then the countries that are in grey have unclear regulations. So in France, for instance, it's very strongly regulated for medical research, but for social research, you could technically just go into a classroom and start collecting data from children. So we do have to find a balance between the international and national regulations. Okay. As I mentioned before, informed consent is important, and the new regulation makes it more difficult. So this is an example of a consent form that was produced for young people, and that did comply with everything that the new GDPR regulation was requiring from us. Now when you look at it, it's 3-page long, it's very wordy. I mean, I'm not sure I would read all of it. And this was like for a project which was working with vulnerable young people for whom most didn't really finish school. So you can imagine that we cannot really be talking about informed consent when this is what we are producing. Another question around informed is how much do young people understand about the project they are actually engaging with. So it happened to us a few months ago where for a big European project we held a workshop with young people around well-being on a Saturday morning, and we worked with a school teacher to ensure that young people would attend, and we got 23 participants, which is quite a lot given it was a Saturday morning, aged 12 to 15. But when we asked them who knows why they are there, actually most of the young people had no clue. They came because the teacher told them to come. And what is more so worrying is that they all signed the personal consent form that we have provided. So there is a question around what is informed consent, and how do you make sure that young people are informed before they join any activity. So this was the first version of the consent form we used for that project. It is still quite long, and as you can see, it's quite wordy. It was supposed to be quite child-friendly, though, in terms of the vocabulary. But we spent some time in that workshop asking young people what they thought about it and helping us design a better version. So they said it was too long. They identified a few words, so we do talk about confidentiality there that they were not comfortable with. And throughout the session, they provided us with a lot of feedback. So what we did is we then worked to revise the consent form and took their feedback into account. So this is what we produced then. They asked us to put everything into one page. They said no paragraphs, bullet points. They said more colors, and they said no complicated words. So when we had a section on confidentiality, we now have a section on important things to know, and we explain what the limits are there without using the word confidentiality. So this is an example of getting to informed consent. And the young people, we did a second workshop with them, and they actually signed off the revised version of the consent form. So thinking about what can prevent participation and meaningful participation in young people, first, the national and international regulations, like by making the consent forms too wordy, they are creating barriers for young people to engage. Second, and this is maybe more the case of England, but when you do engage young people into evaluation activities or research activities, you often do have to go through local authorities and get their consent. Now, this is more so a kind of administrative task, and if well done, they will give you the consent, but it does take time, and when you do evaluations, time is often really important, and we have sometimes missed critical engagements with young people at the early stages of a program because we hadn't had consent from the local authorities to start our work in a timely manner. Then the schools, that's the case in many countries. Schools are very strong gatekeepers. If they do not want you to access the young people, it's just not going to happen. And once again, young people are not even asked whether they want to participate or not. Then, in some countries, you need to seek parental consent before you can even approach the young person. So parents are a strong gatekeeper. And then there are, say, researchers and evaluators when producing cumbersome, consent forms or not being clear about what young people are getting involved in. They are preventing meaningful participation. So just a few messages to take home. First, engaging young people and children in an ethical and meaningful way is actually difficult. It's going to require time, and we are going to make mistakes. So it's acknowledging that it's a learning curve and reflecting on the practice and getting the young people to reflect on your practice and tell you what worked and what not worked. They are the better judges in this situation. In terms of tips, if you are in a school or community setting, what's worked well for us in the past is actually to go to that place and hold a session to explain the evaluation and answer children's questions. It does allow them to put a face to the evaluation, and it allows them to understand what they are actually signing up to. And then there's always ways of working with regulations. So in countries where you do need to get parental consent before a certain age, that means that the child consent is actually not a legal obligation. So something I came to realize actually not so long ago is that it does not have to be then a child-friendly replica of parental consent forms. You can cut out information which may have to appear because of regulations on the parental consent form and keep it to what is important for that young person to understand before they sign that form. And another trick is like if you ever have to work with so many regulations that your consent form is getting quite long, we've used information leaflets on the side of it so that the young people could see clearly in a few bullet points what this was about and why they would join and all different elements to that. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jessica. As we typed in the box, we will have Q&A at the end, and we would really welcome participants to type in some questions, and we'll be able to direct them to each of the speakers. But Jessica, thank you for take-home messages about how do we make sure that we can have consent from young people in ways that they understand and that they truly are informed. So Nick, looking forward to hearing from you about ethics in action.
Great. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and to Youth Power for hosting us. My name is Nick Pettin. I'm a researcher, evaluator, and children's rights advocate. I run my own consultancy specializing in conducting research and evaluation for programs and services where children and youth are the intended beneficiaries. Before I was an evaluator, I worked directly in the community as a frontline worker with children and young people. Through my presentation, I hope to present the unique and what I think innovative aspects of an evaluation that I conducted of an after-school arts-based program called Vibe Arts. Vibe Arts engages young people living in underserved and priority neighborhoods in arts programming that is developed in collaboration with the community and education partners. The evaluation objectives were to carry out evidence-informed research into the impact of increased program hours on participants. Data was collected from students in the program and adult staff and volunteers from Vibe Arts, the Toronto Foundation for Student Success, and the Toronto District School Board. In addition to producing a report of the evaluation, I created an interactive platform that can be used to explore the different areas of the evaluation process, and this is a screenshot of that model. The intent of this platform was to make the evaluation process and findings a little more interesting to engage with. This program is meant to demonstrate how I move through different approaches and methods to come to the results and recommendations. For this short presentation, I'm just going to focus on the ethics in action approach, highlighted in red here, and more specifically on how I used a risk management framework, child protection specialist, and consent and assent processes. Before going into the specifics of the evaluation, I want to just give a quick overview of my conceptual framework. I was schooled in the new sociology of childhood, which is a scientific discipline that promotes assent. This discipline recognizes that children's agency in research is based on the view that children are individuals who experience their world in unique ways, and that these unique experiences are a valued focus of study. When researching childhood, a critical methodological concern is the power dynamics that occur between adults and children. Unequal power can compromise your data and severely distort truth, but more importantly, it can cause harm to your subject. In order to make any truth claims based on the scientific process, careful consideration must be given to the ethics of involving children in research so that the power dynamics can become more equalized while also acknowledging that they will never truly disappear. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child articulates various rights and responsibilities that children have. Article 3 states that the best interests of the child must be the primary concern in making decisions that may affect them, including on their participation in research. As holders of rights, even the youngest children are entitled to express their views. Young children are acutely sensitive to their surroundings and acquire an understanding of people, places, and routines in their lives, along with the awareness of their own identity. They make choices and communicate their feelings, ideas, and wishes in numerous ways long before they can communicate through spoken or written language. It may be through drawings, body movements, or eye contact. Children, like adults, even use silence to express themselves. So going back to the evaluation of Vibe Arts, I face a number of challenges as an external evaluator in the public school board. Namely that research and evaluation being conducted within the school board in Toronto is highly controlled and mostly restricted to faculty from post-secondary institutions. The schools where the program was running were identified as having a high number of external challenges to student academic success. I worked primarily with the charitable division of the school board who were tasked with addressing these challenges. Based on this context, the evaluation goals change throughout the inception phase of the evaluation according to how I can engage with the students and kinds of data I could collect. For example, I was not allowed to handle any data with personally identifiable information, and I had to work closely with the charitable division to ensure that all students had parental consent forms signed and that the individual school programs were prepared to have me come into their school for data collection. As a researcher evaluator, this raised a number of ethical concerns for me in need of solutions. Essentially, the ethical dilemma I face is how do I collect high-quality data for this evaluation to demonstrate the impact of the program while protecting children from the potential harms of participating in research and evaluation. To begin to address these ethical concerns, I prepared a document that articulated the justification for involving children in this evaluation and the various safeguards and child protection mechanisms that are in place or would be developed to ensure that no children were harmed while participating. This was shared with program staff and leadership at the various partner organizations that ran the program. Also, as I mentioned, no personally identifiable information was collected by the evaluators to avoid any risks with handling sensitive information, and I attempted to operationalize child protection protocols and processes that I would use throughout the evaluation. So I went looking into the literature for ethical guidance and came across a lot of good resources. I came across an ethics in action approach from McLaughlin, which articulates the ethical and moral procedures of engaging children in research before, during, and after data collection efforts. McLaughlin suggests that the researcher or evaluator address each of these points throughout the research or evaluation project. Most are fairly straightforward, but then there is the idea of the morally active researcher, which requires a bit more understanding. The concept of the morally active researcher is someone that is highly attuned to ethical issues in the research and continually needs to be reflecting on the ethical dimensions of the research, both by themselves and with any co-researchers. An example of this is when the evaluation team engaged in something called critical reflexivity at the end of each student focus group and integrated that with the risk management framework. So after emerging from the literature on ethical guidance, I decided to operationalize this ethics in action approach with my own customized processes and protocols, which included a guidance document on the justification of involving children in research, the use of a child protection specialist that worked at Right to Play, an international development agency in Canada, an advisory committee, which included youth that had previously participated in the after-school program, a risk management framework, a script to introduce the evaluation to the children, which included reading aloud their rights as research participants, telling them the purpose of the evaluation, including what happens with their data, and explaining consent, assent, and limited confidentiality. And then a resource sheet for program staff that reiterates those items and has contact information. For this evaluation, I had to explain to program staff that involving children in the evaluation would improve the results and recommendations of the evaluation while also ensuring them that my team will operationalize child protection protocols. I did this by preparing a document that articulated the justification for involving children in the evaluation and articulating the various ways that I was going to ensure their safety and represent their best interests. Essentially, I was committing to the program staff that I was going to address all these points at the beginning of the evaluation and operationalize throughout. I also guaranteed that I wasn't collecting any personally identifiable information from the children, including who had parental consent or not. This required a system of working with the school board to distribute the consent forms and the program staff to collect the forms and inform me who has consent and who doesn't. So to work through the potential ethical risks of involving children in the evaluation, I anchored myself to a risk management framework, which consisted of these things listed here. Additionally, I set up an online system where I could communicate this framework with various stakeholders and with the child protection specialist and have a back and forth conversation until we felt that the risk could be successfully mitigated. These were all the risks that were captured before and during the evaluation. Some notable examples here is that a child does not have parental consent but wants to participate. Child reports an incident of abuse at school or home. After-school program staff speak on behalf of the child without their consent. An example of a risk that was identified at the beginning of the evaluation, which actually materialized throughout the evaluation, was when we came to schools to conduct data collection and not all the students had consent forms from their parents, mostly because the students didn't actually talk to the parents about it or forgot the forms at home. We articulated what the response will be at the beginning of the evaluation, which was to allow the child to participate but exclude their data from the analysis. I included here our notes from an exercise that my co-evaluator Wendy and I did after most of the focus groups called critical reflexivity. The purpose of this activity is to ask ourselves a set of predetermined questions to elicit a conversation about how we can be more ethical when working with children and ensure their safety, produce high-quality data for the evaluation, and maximize the benefits of participating in the evaluation. Wendy, my co-evaluator, reminds us about the importance of developing trust and relationships with our youth participants, that providing safe and comfortable environment is crucial, and that understanding the dynamics of the youth groups and being an adult support for them made the difference in the quality of the data that was collected. So in reviewing the literature, there is a lot of bad, unethical, and harmful research out there. As such, we made every effort to engage in high-quality, ethical, and responsible research. If we are to study and represent the lived realities of children and young people for program improvement, we need to be attuned to the ethical nature of working with children and young people, including understanding power dynamics, operationalizing ethics, minimizing harm and increasing benefits, and sharing our journeys with our colleagues. So I just want to say thank you to Vibe Arts, its staff, volunteers, artists, and students, and to Youth Power for hosting us today. And thanks to everyone that joined us today, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. And I've included my email in this webinar so that we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick, and reminding us about rights framework in which we are operating, sharing some of the key literature, and to those who are asking, we will be sending out a copy of these slides with our follow-up and recording of this webinar. And thank you also for just articulating this risk framework and helping us to operationalize what ethics with children and young adolescents could look like in our own evaluations and research. So thank you for that. Now I'd like to pass the baton to Monica, and looking forward to hearing more of your presentations and thinking about other methods in which we can engage young children in our work. So Monica, all yours.
Yes. Thank you, Cassandra. And thank you to Christy and to Rachel also for organizing the webinar, and to all of you for joining us today. In this last presentation, I'm going to focus on ethical issues related to the use of visual methods with young people. And when I say young people, I'm talking about children and adolescents, so I might use those terms interchangeably. So to frame the discussion, I want to start by situating the evaluator and the researcher at a crossroad of dilemmas and sources of guidance, so to speak. So this graph that I adapted from Rose Weiss and her colleagues shows a number of different factors that influence decision-making about ethics in visual research, and include legal and institutional requirements, copyright, professional guidelines, ethic boards, regulations, as well as evaluators' own moral frameworks and the broader context in which the evaluation takes place. That's the area that I added, marked by the dotted line. In cross-cultural work particularly, it's important to note that different groups often have different social norms and understandings that can determine what can be photographed, what can be filmed, or what cannot be photographed or filmed. So for instance, there are many indigenous cultures that hold the belief that a photo steals the soul of a person being photographed. There are also variation in legal regulations across countries, across states and provinces within the same country, and we need to familiarize ourselves with those. Now, none of these factors is enough on its own. So the law and ethics are very closely related, but not everything that is legal is ethical. So knowledge and respect of the law is certainly necessary, but it's not sufficient to inform sound decision-making on ethical issues. The use of visual methods raises particular ethical issues, and evaluators need to zoom in into each concrete situation, keeping all these different angles in mind to make decisions. Now, in the interest of time, I will not elaborate a lot on visual methods, but just to know what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about a collection of methods that are used to understand and interpret still or moving images, so mostly photography and film, that can be either archived somewhere, like many of you might know the CDC image bank, or you can just download them from the web, or generated by the evaluator or the participants expressly for a particular project. This can be done individually or in different groups. Visual data can be collected as a standalone method, or it can be part of mixed methods, and can reflect a number of approaches. And all of those I'm talking about today. There are a number of potential benefits and challenges of using visual methods, and some of you might have used them, or many of you might have used them already. So for instance, visual methods have the potential to engage young people more actively in generating knowledge and assist in building rapport and trust, and may decrease the power differential between the evaluator and the child that Nick referred to. Also, they can trigger the child's memory and therefore result in more detailed descriptions of children's worlds. They can facilitate sharing complex information in culturally sensitive ways and lead to new perspectives and to critical dialogue. Sometimes children learn new skills, like how to take pictures or how to express verbally what they were thinking of when they took the picture. But there are also a number of potential challenges that range from technical difficulties with the flash or the zoom, or obtaining permission from institutions to recruit participants, and the logistics and the cost of coordinating, the camera distribution and retrieval, and analysis and interpretation can be difficult. Visual methods also can create some intimate and delicate situations for both evaluators and participants, and a number of other ethical and legal issues, and those are the ones that we're going to zoom in here. I'm going to follow the guidelines for ethical visual research methods that Susan Cox and her colleagues at the University of Melbourne developed. I think they're very clear. They're publicly available. Cassandra referred also to my involvement with the ERIC, the Ethics in Research Involving Children, a UNICEF-sponsored resource. You can also access that online, led by colleagues in Australia and New Zealand. Is an excellent resource as well. But I'm going to use Susan Cox and guidelines because they focus specifically on visual research methods, and go through these 6 categories briefly now. So from an ethics perspective, confidentiality and anonymity refer to the evaluators or the researchers' commitment to protect someone's privacy in regard to any information that was shared in relationship of trust in research. From a legal perspective, this is rather an issue of personal data protection. So I will only raise the flag that research data given in confidence do not enjoy the legal privilege, and researchers may, and in some cases in the US particularly, they've been liable to subpoena by a court. The other legal aspect to consider is ensuring that the data is always securely stored. Now, technology advances fast. Facial recognition, GIS, GPS make it difficult, if at all possible, to guarantee absolute anonymity. And in contrast, some participants who create visual work may not want to remain anonymous. And this has happened to me a number of times working with children and adolescents. They want their names posted next to the photo they have taken. Now, a number of researchers, visual researchers, actually use all the data with consent without anonymizing or using pseudonyms, and they're actually quite vocal in sharing their concern about the increasing ethical regulation that might lead to unnecessary self-censorship and limitations. But that's a highly contested issue, could take us the whole session, so I'll just leave it aside. I'll just emphasize, and Jessica also talked about this in the context of consent, the importance of familiarizing ourselves with the law that is applicable in the jurisdiction where we work, and also the social norms that are used in a particular context where we're working. And also, evaluators need to carefully consider the impact of disseminating identifiable images and plan and adopt strategies to reduce and manage risk. So, for instance, we might decide not to use certain aspects of the visual data we have. We also have to consider the different ways in which the study or the project can potentially benefit or harm participants. And when I'm saying participants, I'm talking about the individuals or maybe the children themselves, but also the community more broadly or their families. This is a process that extends beyond the planning phase. We need to be alert. For instance, sharing intimate information or images of intimate spaces can create discomfort. Youth may later regret having shared certain information and feel vulnerable to criticism. In general, in countries like the US or the UK, there's no specific legal prohibition for people can take photographs in public spaces, in the street, in a park, including children, or places where they have permission to take photographs. Of course, without such insistence that it might be interpreted as harassment or anything like that. But what constitutes public and semi-public and private space is not always clear and varies a lot from one society to another. So as we create the plan to reduce risk that I just talked about, evaluators need to anticipate the ways in which we need to protect privacy in a particular context. Consent, and Jessica has talked a lot about this. I'll focus specifically on visual methods. Respect calls for people to decide whether they want to participate or not, and this of course includes children and adolescents. Now, consent entails not only consent to take or to make visual images, but also consent to use the images. So evaluators must ensure that consent procedures follow what is locally acceptable. For that, it's important to engage families and communities and to establish ongoing consultation and feedback mechanisms from the beginning. Consent is a continued process of consultation, of negotiation, and in fact, it's advisable to really start negotiating the use of images as early on, as soon as the initial interview is conducted or even earlier. It's also advisable to separate consent to participate in the evaluation from consent to make images, and consent to release and use the images for evaluation, for publication, for dissemination, so that we set clear expectations from the start and we negotiate particular images, particular formats, and contexts. We need to always tell participants in advance how we're going to use the photographs, give them permission to ask us that the images are not used or not shared, or even that they're destroyed until the moment of publication. I think it's also good practice to give participants an opportunity to see the images before they decide. Now, authorship is another important point. Acknowledging authorship is not only important to respect the integrity of the evaluation process, but also to make sure that we maximize the contributions of young people, to maintain strong relationships with them, and to prevent any possible disappointment in the future, because I tell you it does happen. Now, the big question is who owns the images, and this is a very complex question that involves legal and intellectual property issues, as well as cultural issues, moral issues. Ultimately, it's important because it determines who needs to give permission to release any image, and both individually or collectively. In general, ownership, talking about property rights now, belongs to the person taking the image or the institution where they work. At least in the Anglo-Saxon world it does. Participants can also assign the copyright to the evaluator for later use, and it's also possible to negotiate shared ownership. So for instance, if a graphic designer manipulates an image, maybe he or she could share ownership with the person who took the original picture. Of course, the question comes up of what to do with images that we have found, right, like historical photographs or pre-existing photographs, and should evaluators attempt to establish consent in those cases? In any case, commitments I referred to earlier about authorship, about ownership, about storage, about duplication, and consent need to be negotiated continuously. It might help to have a partnership agreement that is written, including in that agreement what to do in cases when the participant wants to withdraw consent afterwards. Now, evaluators also need to consider which, how, and when, and where, and in what context will the visual evaluation products be displayed. So in some cases, our critical analysis of the images can distress participants. Scanning or cropping may change the original meaning of the image. Blurring has been highly criticized by some researchers because it can dehumanize participants, not fully ensure anonymity. Try to step away from an image and you see that it becomes clearer than it did when you were very close to it. And it can deny participants the right to choose to reveal their own identity. There are also other methods like blocking out eyes that are also controversial. There's always the possibility that the audience will interpret or use the visual products in a way that is unapproved or unintended. So evaluators have to consider the implications and the possible unintended consequences of displaying and reproducing visual products. And also it's advisable to use visual data with text to make explicit the intended meaning and to consider the context and therefore reduce the risk of misinterpretation. Just wanted to show a picture from one of my projects in Laos. This was taken by a 9-year-old girl in an ethnic boarding school, and we were discussing things and people and places that were important to her, and she showed, you know, a spoon and a bowl that was important, and it led us to a very rich discussion about her daily life. Okay. I'm going to think I passed quickly to class boundaries. I'm aware we don't have enough time, so I'll just say the evaluators need to clarify what is the role of the evaluator, the role of participants, the purposes of the visual methods. Is it for evaluation? Is it for community engagement? And to do that early on as part of the plan and the negotiations. Have my two last slides. I'll pass on quickly. I'm aware I'm taking a lot of time. So when we're taking pictures of third parties, it's important to teach young people that they need to take permission before recording or taking a photograph. In some contexts, there are also legal limitations, but it's also polite and good ethical practice to get consent whenever they're identifiable individuals or when people are in private spaces where it's reasonable to expect not to be photographed. In any case, when we get a consent form signed, it doesn't give the evaluators unrestricted ways to use what we get, the images. The conditions need to be negotiated. So to wrap up, I'll just emphasize some points that evaluators and researchers working with children and adolescents must build and strive to maintain relationships of mutual trust that might lead to joint ownership of the data. We also need to consider the longevity of the images and the implications of reusing them and making them publicly available. The implications of sharing the images need to be carefully explained to children and adolescents and to their parents and guardians so that they can make valid consent. We also need to allow participants to comment on the images before publication and change up their minds about the use and dissemination of images. And finally, we need to consider the political, the social and cultural context in which the photos will be viewed and interpreted. This is what Clark, Prosser and Wiles call situated visual ethics, so that more flexible ethical practices that reflect local norms and values are used. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Cassandra now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Monica. Yeah, I really appreciated reflecting on and you sharing some of the opportunities and these ethical considerations around visual methods and particularly around photography. It is something that we've been thinking a lot about here in youth-powered learning when we're using images in different ways. And you referred to the found images, and many of us will go into searching for an image that sort of represents what we're trying to convey for a publication or something, but the permission of that individual or how it's being used is sometimes unclear. So I appreciate the thought-provoking guidance that you've outlined here today. So we want to open it up for questions to our attendees or participants here online, you can put them into the chat room. There's a couple that have actually come through already. One of the questions, and I think just following on what you've said here, Monica, is thinking about that longevity in the use of digital images and translating that to young people who are taking some of these pictures. So one of our participants have asked, how do we convey that? How do we help them understand the sort of time band that could be on the use of digital images?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. That's a really good question. I think it will vary from one context to another. Obviously, it's not the same thing to be working with a 7-year-old and to be working with a 17-year-old. It's not the same if the topic is a sensitive topic, like the evaluation touches on something that might be pertaining their body, or might be pertaining like parts of their life that might be considered private in a particular cultural context. So it's difficult to give an answer that would work for every possible situation. I always find that, particularly if we're working cross-culturally, this would be a conversation I would have with my partners locally. But there's sometimes sharing the personal experience can help make it more real. And so, for example, I've had cases where young people have not given permission to use the photographs immediately. They wanted to see them and make the decision after the evaluation, depending on how they saw the pictures and the evaluation. So part of that might be contextual. It might be helpful also to, as I say, in sharing personal experience, if you've had, if you had a tattoo, is kind of the equivalent of, I like to use metaphors, like what if you get a tattoo that cannot be removed? What if later in life you meet someone who's like trying to bring it to their world and to something they can relate to, and even to something that might have changed in their own development. So you might refer to an earlier period in their life, something that might have seemed absolutely common, understandable when they were 10 years younger, and now they wouldn't do it. So kind of grasping that idea of change within themselves. But this certainly requires negotiation, and not only with the young person, but sometimes with the parents. And at times it's difficult because they will have conflicting opinions, the parents and the young people. And so there's the legal aspect of it, of having to who you need to listen to, but ethically you need to listen to both.
That's helpful. I think this topic around photography is something on people's mind. There's been quite a few different threads of questions. Some of it is around when young people are the photographers, so using more of a photo story type of approach where young people are taking pictures. The comment here from Jane is thinking about consent when they're expressing themselves to photography. Are there special considerations there? There's another question around also even just changing one's mind. So given consent, but now don't want to consent once the picture has been there. I'm wondering if you could comment on that as well. And I'm going to ask Jessica and Nick to think about sort of that change in consent that, so not just in photography, but what might happen later. So first with you, Monica.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, certainly anybody, any participant in an evaluation or a research study can dissent, right? Can withdraw their consent. And we are obliged to respect it without even a need to ask questions. I mean, sometimes it's good to probe lightly to make sure there's no confusion, misunderstanding, but really no pressure whatsoever. The same right they have to consent, to agree and be part of a study, they have to dissent, to withdraw from it. So sometimes it's disappointing for us. The reason why I advise that we separate consent to participate in the evaluation, from consent to make and take visual images and consent to dissemination, is that if you have 3 separate boxes in the consent form, if you use the written form, because of course consent can be documented orally and or filmed or audio recorded, it will depend on the context. And if you are working within the context of a research institution or a university, you will have to go through an ethics review board, and you'll have to justify using one of those methods. But I advise using separate consent, because that will allow a participant to say, yes, I want to be part of the evaluation. If you're using photo voice, or if they are taking their own photographs, they might even go and take the photographs, but maybe they don't want the photographs to be shown to anybody else. In some cases, you might need to arrange for alternative ways to maybe interview them. If you were planning to do a focus group setting, it might have to be individually with that particular person, but it's doable. I'm not sure I heard the click, so maybe I need to wrap up. I'm okay, Cassandra. I read the click.
Baker Jessica, I wanted to give you a chance to kind of jump in on several of these threads.
Great, yeah, a couple of points. The first on the separate consent forms. I think someone in the chat box mentioned that it was advised earlier that the consent form should hold on one page, and that is the case for the evaluation. But as Monica said, it's a very different matter and purpose and context, like when you look at visual data. So whilst we had the consent form to take part in the project on one page, we had a separate document for pictures, allowing us to take pictures and using the pictures, etc. So I do think it's a really important thing that they are separate documents. They serve different purposes, really. And in regards to the change in consent, in Europe, the regulation is a bit funny about it. So it says that the participants have the right to withdraw unless it's going to harm the science. So that's a kind of a vague concept. And as Monica said, sometimes regulations are not very ethical. So I would suggest that indeed, whilst in terms of the law, you might be able to keep the information provided, in terms of ethics, you should do your best to, delete the information and all the data you have gathered from a young person who comes back to you and says they don't want to be part anymore. Now, we do explain to a lot of our young people, if they are in part of big groups, for instance, and we are transcribing the tapes, that we may not be able to identify their personal contributions. So there are limitations to deleting some of that information if we cannot identify who said what in a focus group. But in terms of surveys or interviews, that's a very easy process, and we have to respect the wish of young people in that regard.
And if I could just add a few things, I'm recognizing that the world of digital media and the internet is a rapidly changing context. So I just want to emphasize that I think there is responsibility on both parts, that there is a responsibility for young people to understand their rights and to understand how they can manage that throughout their lifetime. And I mentioned something in the chat box around critical media literacy, and there's a lot of good resources on how to work and educate young people around how they understand how the internet works and how media is retained and how they can take a bit more control over that. I also talk a lot through my presentation about operationalizing ethics. So something I mean by that, for example, is developing very explicit processes and policies at your organization that addresses a lot of these concerns, so that program staff on a regular basis come back to that and address that in light of these changing contexts. And then the other thing too I wanted to mention is just as we're going about our work, just sort of take a look at the different technological systems and software and applications that are being developed that could, for example, help you to ensure that certain data is being deleted after a couple of years and use those systems to make sure your data management processes are responsible and sort of reflect the needs of the people that you're working with and evaluating.
Super, that's helpful. A couple questions have come in about resources and where we can find more information. So I'm going to pull up Monica's slide about just some of the references that she pulled in. Nick, you mentioning the digital media site. Stacy asked about just being able to share some of the youth consent forms, Jessica, that you had raised, and I think you had a really nice evolution. I don't know if those are publicly available. So are there other spaces, resources that we can point people to, and we can include that in the follow-up?
So I just quickly typed in the chat box. If you search for YFETIGAEA, that's the topical interest group from AEA. And on that page, there is a resource page that includes a lot of documents and websites that we had mentioned in this presentation.
Yes,
Great.
I've mentioned in my presentation, but definitely ERIC is a very useful resource in general for ethical issues involving young people. And then, of course, the guidelines for ethical visual research methods that Susan Cox developed. And a lot of work that Rose Wiles and John Prouser and other colleagues have done for the National Center for Research Methods in the UK are also publicly available online and have very useful guidelines for visual ethics.
So
I am happy to share the consent form. It will be made available on the website page of the project, but it's not there yet. But and we might just wait. We have another workshop happening in Croatia, so we might have like final little tweaks made to it. But I'm happy to share it once that's done.
Thank you, Jessica, very much. Well, we are nearly at the end of our time, so just wanted to thank the three of you. We will follow up with everybody with recordings, with the slides. We'll include in it a list of these resources as some reminders. In terms of just connecting with Youth Power, I mean, a big part of today's webinar and what we do is continue to connect and think about how we are supporting young people globally. And so through this PYD approach, we've really tried to be a go-to platform and community. So we have 4 communities of practice. We are a learning hub both in youthpower.org and a newly launched youth lead platform that's really focused on young change makers themselves. If you have information, and I'm going to have my colleague go to the next slide, and research that you've been doing connected to positive youth development, we do have a learning agenda, a positive youth development learning agenda, where we are looking to close the gaps around measurement in the PYD space, really understanding the impacts of PYD, thinking about youth engagement, and how do we do that in ethical and supportive ways. So a lot of this discussion ties to that learning agenda. We would love to hear from you. So please send us and share with us the work that you've been doing that could help continue to advance this field. We can be your amplifier, and we would be looking to synthesize that against this sort of larger field. So we want to say thank you to everybody, and we look forward to continuing to engage as we go forward. So like I said, we will wrap up, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Great, thank you.